Imagine if one scientific idea changed the eating habits of almost the entire Western world. An idea that influenced governments, dietary guidelines, transformed supermarket shelves, and convinced generations of people that one everyday nutrient was quietly damaging their hearts. That nutrient was saturated fat. For decades, we were told that butter, cheese, whole milk, and red meat should be eaten sparingly because saturated fat raised cholesterol, clogged our arteries, and ultimately caused heart disease. It was a simple message, easy to understand and easy to remember. But as is often the case in science, the truth turned out to be far more complicated. Hello, my name is David Van Dyke and I've been a qualified sports science scientist for over 4 decades. This channel's reason for existing is to make you an expert in your own body. Today's video is about science and conspiracy theories. You see, the subject I'm delving into has been misconstrued and I believe misrepresented right across social media. If I'm going to make you all experts in your own physiology, then it needs me to represent theories and suppositions accurately. With this in mind, I've delved deeply into the research of today's subject matter in order to put right some wrongs and balance the scales of science concomitant to the time the theories first came into being. This is not a story about conspiracy theories or dishonest scientists. It is a story about how science evolves. Researchers make observations, develop hypotheses, test those ideas, and as new evidence emerges, sometimes discover that reality is more nuanced than they themselves first believed. To understand why saturated fat became one of the most feared nutrients in history, we need to travel back to the years after the Second World War. And coming up now is Chapter 1. Second World War. At that time, medicine was celebrating remarkable victories over infectious diseases, but a new threat was emerging. Heart disease was becoming the leading cause of death across much of the developed world. Men who appeared healthy were dying suddenly from heart attacks, and doctors had little idea why. Scientists began searching for answers. They investigated smoking, stress, exercise, obesity, and diet. Among those researchers was an American physiologist named Ancel Keys. Keys noticed that people living in Mediterranean countries appeared to suffer far fewer heart attacks than those living in countries such as the United States, United Kingdom, and Finland. Their diets were also very different. Mediterranean populations ate more vegetables, legumes, fruit, olive oil and fish, while Northern Europeans and Americans generally consumed more meat, butter and dairy products. At around the same time, researchers were discovering that people with higher blood cholesterol levels were more likely to develop heart disease. Laboratory studies also showed that saturated fat could raise LDL cholesterol in many individuals. Gradually, these observations came together to form what became known as the diet-heart hypothesis. Saturated fat raises cholesterol, cholesterol contributes to blocked arteries, and reducing saturated fat should therefore reduce heart disease. Simple. It was logical and biologically a plausible idea, and it offered something desperately needed at that time, a potentially preventable cause of one of the world's biggest killers. But a plausible theory is only the beginning of science. Every hypothesis must eventually be tested against real-world evidence. As larger studies were conducted over the following decades, researchers began to discover that nutrition was far more complex than anyone had imagined. This is the story of how one scientific idea changed the world, and how the science that followed forced us to rethink whether the story had ever been quite that simple. Chapter 2. How a hypothesis became a global belief. The theory that saturated fat contributed to heart disease gained enormous momentum during the 1950s and 1960s. Much of that influence came from two landmark studies that helped shape modern cardiovascular medicine. The first was Ancel Keys' 7 countries study, which began in 1958 and followed nearly 13,000 middle-aged men living in 7 countries, including the United States, Finland, Italy, Greece and Japan. The researchers found that populations eating diets higher in saturated fat generally had higher cholesterol levels and experienced more heart disease, while those following traditional Mediterranean and Japanese diets had much lower rates. The study became one of the most influential investigations in nutritional science and introduced the world to what we now recognise as the Mediterranean diet. However, it is important to understand what the study could and could not show. It was observational, meaning it identified associations rather than proving cause and effect. The populations differed in many ways besides diet, including smoking habits, physical activity, body weight, healthcare and lifestyle. Saturated fat was only one piece of a much larger picture. At around the same time, another landmark investigation was taking place in the United States. The Framingham Heart study followed thousands of residents over many decades to identify the factors that predicted heart disease. It confirmed that smoking, high blood pressure, diabetes and elevated cholesterol all increased cardiovascular risk. These findings remain some of the most important discoveries in preventative medicine. Taken together, the 7 countries study and the Framingham Heart study appeared to support the growing belief that reducing saturated fat would reduce heart disease. Medical organisations, including the American Heart Association, began recommending that people replace saturated fat with healthier, unsaturated fats found in foods such as vegetable oils, nuts and seeds. Notice the wording, replace saturated fat with unsaturated fat. That recommendation was more nuanced than many people remember today. Unfortunately, as scientific advice spread through newspapers, television and public health campaigns, much of that nuance disappeared. The message gradually evolved into something much simpler. Fat is bad. The food industry responded by producing thousands of low-fat products. To make these foods taste acceptable, manufacturers replaced fat with refined starches and added sugars. Ironically, this was never the original intention of the dietary advice, yet it became one of its most significant unintended consequences. By the late 20th century, the idea that saturated fat was the primary dietary cause of heart disease had become accepted wisdom. Few people questioned it, and even fewer challenged it publicly. Yet while governments were issuing dietary guidelines and food manufacturers were reformulating their products, scientists were carrying out a different kind of research. Unlike observational studies, these were carefully controlled clinical trials designed to answer one simple question. If people actually reduce saturated fat, do they suffer fewer heart attacks and live longer? The answers would prove to be far more complicated than anyone expected. Chapter 3. The studies that changed the conversation. By the late 1960s, the diet-heart hypothesis had become widely accepted. Observational studies had linked saturated fat with higher cholesterol and higher cholesterol with heart disease. But one crucial question still remained unanswered. If people actually reduce saturated fat in their diets, would they suffer fewer heart attacks and live longer? Answering that question required a different type of research. Instead of simply observing what people ate, scientists needed to conduct randomized controlled trials, assigning participants to different diets and following them for years. These studies are considered one of the strongest forms of evidence because they are better able to distinguish cause from coincidence. Several major trials were launched, and many researchers expected them to provide definitive proof that reducing saturated fat would dramatically reduce heart disease. The results were more complicated than anyone had anticipated. One of the largest was the Minnesota Coronary Survey, conducted between 1968 and 1973. More than 9,000 residents of hospitals and nursing homes were assigned either a diet high in saturated fat or one in which saturated fat was largely replaced with vegetable oils rich in polyunsaturated fat. As expected, the replacement diet lowered blood cholesterol. Surprisingly, however, it did not produce a clear reduction in deaths from heart disease or overall mortality. Even more controversially, the full results were not published until many years after the study had ended, prompting renewed interest when researchers later re-examined the data. Another influential trial was the Sydney, Australia Diet Heart study. Participants who had already experienced a heart attack were advised to replace saturated fats with sunflower oil, a vegetable oil rich in omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. Once again, cholesterol levels fell. However, when the original data were recovered and reanalyzed decades later, the group consuming more sunflower oil experienced a higher rate of death than the control group. The reasons remain debated, and the findings should be interpreted cautiously, but they challenge the assumption that simply replacing saturated fat with any polyunsaturated fat would automatically improve health. Not every study produced disappointing results, however. The Oslo Diet Heart study conducted in Norway reported fewer heart attacks among men advised to change their diet and lifestyle after a previous heart attack. However, the intervention involved far more than reducing saturated fat. Participants also increased their intake of fish, vegetables and vegetable oils, reduced smoking and made other lifestyle changes. This made it impossible to determine which aspect of the program was responsible for the benefit. Similarly, the Los Angeles Veterans Study found fewer cardiovascular events in people consuming more polyunsaturated fat, but the dietary intervention involved multiple changes rather than saturated fat alone. These studies suggested that improving overall diet could reduce cardiovascular risk, but they did not isolate saturated fat as the sole explanation. Taken together, these trials painted a far more complex picture than the original diet heart hypothesis had suggested. Lowering cholesterol did not always translate into fewer heart attacks or longer lives. The type of fat used to replace saturated fat appeared to matter, and improvements in health were often accompanied by many other dietary and lifestyle changes. This did not really mean that the original hypothesis had been disproved. Rather, it suggested that nutrition was far more complicated than focusing on a single nutrient. Foods are complex mixtures of fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and thousands of biologically active compounds. Human diets are even more complex, and people's lifestyles differ enormously. As the 20th century drew to a close, scientists began to realise that asking whether saturated fat was simply good or bad was probably the wrong question. A better question was beginning to emerge. If reducing saturated fat was not enough on its own, what did the best available evidence actually tell us about eating for a healthy heart? That question would shape a new generation of nutrition research and challenge many long-held assumptions about the role of saturated fat in our diet. Chapter 4. What the modern evidence really shows. As the 21st century began, nutrition science entered a new era. Rather than relying on individual studies, researchers started combining the results of many investigations into large, systematic reviews and meta-analyses. By pooling data from hundreds of thousands of participants, they hope to answer a question that had divided scientists for decades. Does eating saturated fat actually increase the risk of heart disease? And the answers were more nuanced than many people expected. In 2010, a widely discussed meta-analysis led by Patricia Siri Tarino examined data from 21 prospective studies involving nearly 350,000 people. The researchers found no significant association between saturated fat intake and the risk of coronary heart disease. Same for stroke or overall cardiovascular disease. The study attracted worldwide attention because it challenged one of nutrition's most deeply rooted assumptions. A few years later, another large review led by Rajv Chowdhury reached similar conclusions. After analysing data from numerous observational studies and clinical trials, the authors concluded that the evidence did not clearly support the idea that saturated fat alone was associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Although aspects of the review were later debated by other scientists, it reinforced the growing view that the story was far more complicated than previously believed. The picture became clearer as researchers focused on a question that earlier studies had often overlooked. If you reduce saturated fat, what are you eating instead? This turned out to be one of the most important discoveries in modern nutrition. Replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, such as those found in oily fish, nuts, seeds, and some vegetable oils, generally appears to reduce cardiovascular risk. This finding has been supported by several clinical trials and remains the basis of many dietary recommendations today. However, replacing saturated fat with refined carbohydrates tells a very different story. Swapping butter for white bread, sugary breakfast cereals, or highly processed snack foods often produces little benefit and may worsen important markers of metabolic health. Triglycerides can rise, protective HDL cholesterol may fall, and blood sugar control can deteriorate. In other words, simply removing saturated fat is not enough. What replaces it matters enormously. Another important development has been a greater appreciation of the food matrix. Scientists have realised that foods cannot be judged solely by the amount of saturated fat they contain. Cheese, yogurt, dark chocolate and unprocessed meat all contain saturated fat, yet they have very different effects on health because they also contain different proteins, minerals, vitamins and other biological compounds. Increasingly, researchers are studying whole foods and dietary patterns rather than single nutrients in isolation. Large international studies have reinforced this broader perspective. The PURE study, which followed more than 135,000 people across 18 countries, reported that higher saturated fat intake was not associated with a greater risk of death from cardiovascular disease. In fact, participants consuming moderate amount of saturated fat often experience similar, or in some analyses, lower overall mortality than those consuming very low amounts. Like all observational research, PURE has limitations and cannot prove cause and effect, but it added to the growing evidence that the relationship between saturated fat and health is more complex than once believed. At the same time, organisations such as the Cochrane Collaboration have continued to review the totality of the evidence. Their analyses generally conclude that reducing saturated fat can produce a modest reduction in cardiovascular events when it is specifically replaced by polyunsaturated fat. However, the effect is relatively small and the evidence does not support the idea that saturated fat alone is the dominant cause of heart disease. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson modern nutrition has taught us. Heart disease is not caused by one nutrient. It develops through the interaction of many factors, including genetics, smoking, blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, physical inactivity, overall diet, and metabolic health. The simple message that saturated fat is bad has gradually been replaced by a more sophisticated understanding. Nutrition is not about fearing individual foods. It is about recognising patterns, improving the overall quality of the diet, and understanding that context matters. With that perspective, we can finally answer the question that has shaped this entire story. Were we wrong to fear saturated fat, or have we simply been asking the wrong question all along? Chapter 5, what should we believe today? So, after more than 70 years of research, where does that leave us? Was Ancel Keys wrong? Not exactly. Did saturated fat turn out to be the dietary villain we were led to believe? No. The truth, as is so often in science, lies somewhere in the middle. Ancel Keys asked an important question at a time when heart disease was claiming millions of lives. His research helped scientists recognise that diet plays a role in cardiovascular health, and his work contributed to the growing appreciation of healthier dietary patterns such as the Mediterranean diet. Those were significant achievements. However, as more evidence accumulated, it became clear that the original diet-heart hypothesis was too simple to explain a disease as complex as coronary heart disease. Heart disease is not caused by one food, one nutrient, or even one molecule. It develops over decades through the interaction of genetics, blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, physical activity, body weight, chronic inflammation, insulin resistance and metabolic health, and the overall quality of the diet. Saturated fat is only one small part of that much larger picture. Modern research suggests that moderate amount of saturated fat consumed as part of an overall healthy dietary pattern are unlikely to be the major determinant of cardiovascular risk for most people. At the same time, replacing saturated fat with healthier unsaturated fats does appear to provide some cardiovascular benefit. Replacing it with refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods, on the other hand, provides no benefit and may even make matters worse. That is a very different message from the one many of us grew up hearing. For decades, nutrition became fixated on individual nutrients. Fat was labelled bad. Carbohydrates were promoted as the healthier alternative. Food manufacturers responded exactly as you would expect. They removed fat and replaced it with sugar, refined starches, and highly processed ingredients, marketed as low-fat and heart-healthy, even though many were nutritionally very poor. Looking back, perhaps that was one of the greatest lessons of this entire story. When we focus too narrowly on a single nutrient, we risk missing the bigger picture. People do not eat isolated grams of saturated fat. They eat meals. They eat dietary patterns. They eat the food matrix. They live lifestyles. A piece of mature cheese is not nutritionally equivalent to a sugary breakfast cereal simply because one contains more saturated fat than the other. A steak served with vegetables is not the same as a fast food burger accompanied by fries and a sugary drink. Context matters. Increasingly, nutrition scientists are moving away from asking whether individual nutrients are good or bad and towards asking a more meaningful question: what does an overall healthy diet look like? And the answer is remarkably consistent. Eat plenty of vegetables and fruit, include legumes, nuts and whole grains. Choose minimally processed foods wherever possible. Eat fish regularly if you enjoy it. Use unsaturated fats such as olive oil in place of saturated fats where it makes sense. Stay physically active, avoid smoking and vaping, maintain a healthy body weight, get enough sleep, manage stress. When those foundations are in place, the occasional pat of butter or serving of full-fat yogurt is not going to determine your future health. Perhaps the biggest mistake we made was believing that one nutrient could explain one of the most complicated diseases known to medicine. The story of saturated fat reminds us to be cautious whenever we hear absolute nutritional claims. Foods are rarely all good or all bad. Biology is rarely black and white. The human body is astonishingly complex, and our health depends on countless interacting factors rather than a single ingredient on our plate. So, should you fear saturated fat? The evidence suggests that the fear has been overstated. Saturated fat deserves moderation, not panic. It is neither a miracle nutrient nor a dietary poison. For most people, it can be included sensibly within an overall healthy lifestyle without becoming a threat to cardiovascular health. In this end, this video was never really about butter or saturated fat. It was about how science works. It was about how one compelling idea shaped the eating habits of millions of people, how new evidence challenged that idea, and how our understanding continues to evolve. Because the real lesson is this: science is not a collection of unchangeable truths. It is a process of asking better questions. And perhaps the healthiest thing we can do is remain curious enough to change our minds when the evidence changes. See you next time.